Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're the Spokane Community Against Racism panel. And to get going, I'm just going to introduce folks or have folks introduce themselves, and then we're going to move into sort of a short presentation. Then afterwards, hopefully have a great back and forth with folks. Right off the bat, we're just gonna ask if people could focus their questions in the Q&A box. If possible, that would be the most convenient for us. And yeah, that's it. To give you a sense of who I am, again, my name is Jack Archer. I use they, them pronouns. I am the organizer and program coordinator for Spokane Community Against Racism and have been with SCAR since near, but not quite at our beginning in 2017. With me, I have Pastor Rick Matters. I'm just gonna move from left to right in the little boxes. Rick, would you like to tell people just like a quick sentence about yourself?
Sure. I also came on board SCAR early on when the first group formed, and it's been innovating and energizing and life-giving work.
Awesome. Rick has done a lot to communicate with our educators in the area, to communicate with various community members, participates in different subgroups, and generally goes to a lot of meetings on SCAR's behalf and is always out into the community. Puyan, would you like to say a word about yourself?
Thank you, Jack. I'm Puyan Lam. I am another member of the SCAR Steering Committee. And also for today, I will be helping as a moderator. So I will be the ones scanning your questions or comments, and also to check if anyone wants to make their comments or raise the questions verbally. And so if you want to do that, then use the raise hand function, but I will be the one kind of monitoring that. And also after Jack's presentation, I'm going to ask my fellow steering committee members a few questions to get things going. But anytime, feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A. You don't have to wait for everything to be done. So this is my role for today.
Thank you. Leon is also a professor and knows a lot about statistics, and so is our numbers person, and definitely helps us understand data and look at things from a data approach. So I just want to throw that out there. And then of course we have our founder, Reverend Walter Kendricks, who's given me a face already. Would you like to talk a little bit, Walter?
Hey, good morning. I'm Walter Kendricks. I am pastor of Morning Star Missionary Baptist Church here in Spokane. Founder of SCAR. I don't know, it embarrasses me to even think about how far we've come in the years since we organized, but I didn't do it by myself. I take no credit. Give glory to God. And I'm glad to be here today. So thank you so much, Jack.
Thank you. All right, with that, I believe this is the part where I screen share and I make sure that my screen is good to share. And going to sort of tell you a little bit about who we are as an organization and what we're here to talk to you about today. Let me make that. Here we go. All right, so I couldn't resist a 2020 reference. So it's about how we galvanize advocacy around our platform for change. So first, to understand us and what we're about, you have to understand our mission and how we began. In 2017, an all-white jury here in Spokane ruled that somehow it was self-defense for a white man to shoot a black man in the back from nearly 30 feet away. This verdict elicited a lot of hurt, hurt and rage from members of the community, especially Black people and people of color. And SCAR was born out of that rage. Our focus then and now is to address the brokenness of a criminal justice system that allowed a verdict like that to happen, and to bring accountability to all facets of that system. We identify and access racial disparities through education, advocacy, research, community engagement, policy advocacy, and challenging the existing organizations and structures. That last bit, challenging the existing organizations and structures, is a huge part of what we're going to be talking about today. So let's talk about the platform for change. With our mission kind of already set, we move into 2020 with the murder of George Floyd. And Spokane, like many other cities across the country and the world, was driven to reckon with the realities of interpersonal and systemic racism. For many of us, we've been reckoning with this for quite a while, but this was kind of the first time that it became, not the first time, I would say the next time. This was the next time that it became a huge, public concern that shook everybody, not just the people who had to live day in and day out with it. It was in that context that we, SCAR, worked with several community partners to draft what we call the Platform for Change. It's a vision of systemic change for the Spokane community that embraces a holistic vision of public safety, and a vision that re-examines what is considered crime, accounts for its root causes, and recognizes that shared prosperity and community care are at the heart of a healthy society. Right? So we're trying to find ways to look at our justice system and say, this is messed up. How can it work for everyone? How can it actually be just for everyone? So let's talk about what that process was. We spearheaded that process of writing a platform for change based on what we identified as needed policy and what some of our closest allies in the work were already doing. So it was a process of first identifying, what issues were we looking at, what needed to change, essentially. I personally spent some time just talking with our steering committee, 4 members of which are here today. We did a lot of internal talking, but then I also did a fair amount of partner canvassing. That's the next step. That is talking to people who we'd worked with in the community already. Organizations like the Peace and Justice Action League of Spokane, which is another local organization, our local chapter of the NAACP, members of the Asian Pacific Islander Coalition here in Spokane. We have a lot of other organizations like Greater Spokane Progress and Smart Justice Spokane and Planned Parenthood of Greater Washington, North Idaho, and just talking to them and saying, okay, we are looking at these things, these justice issues that are messed up in our area. Can you talk to me about what it is that you're up to right here and what you think of these issues? And then there was drafting. So I was the primary drafter for our Platform for Change, but I was by no means the only writer. I ended up taking a lot of language from work that other people had already done. That partner canvassing that happened earlier was really a way for me to assess the landscape of how things were being discussed. And then so that when we wrote something down, we weren't just writing down, oh, hey, like this sounds cool, but actually drafting a document that took into account the work that had been done to that point. And something that keeps coming up in our document was the phrase, X organization has done a lot of work in this area, listen to them. Ultimately, this was a document that, as it was drafted, that was addressed to our public officials, addressed to our mayor and our city council and our county commissioners, the people who control the policy, and telling them this is what we needed to change. The next bit was to seek sign-ons, essentially saying, okay, do we all agree on this? Does this all sound like stuff that we want to say to our community? And from that process, together, this team pulled together the signatures, the sign-ons of originally 26, although some of those organizations are no longer with us and some organizations have changed in the time since, but 26 sign-ons of various, whether they were chapter organizations of larger orgs like Planned Parenthood of Greater Washington, North Idaho, or whether they were Spokane specific organizations. We got 26 orgs representing thousands of Spokanites to sign on to this thing. From there, we essentially launched it with a press conference outside of our city hall saying, hey, look, all of these people want this same thing. And then it's been a process of ongoing support and follow-up, talking with our fellow coalition members, working with them to say, hey, this bit of policy that we mentioned in the Platform for Change is becoming particularly relevant right now. Can we, again, pipe up and remind them that we spoke together on this and continue speaking together on this? The Platform for Change is thus served as a guiding document for how we approach certain policy things. And also as sort of a for me personally, as an organizer, I just keep coming back to it and say, how does this tie in? So that we're looking at how does it tie in so that we can keep sort of reminding people. It's a nice touchstone that helps for me ground my organizing work for SCAR. So here's who signed on, just to give you a sense of who we're talking about. I'm not going to read all the names. I'm just going to sort of give a second for people to look. People who live in Spokane or live in Washington might be familiar with some of these organizations. People who don't might not be. So to give you just a sense of what we're looking at, we have everything from, organizations that are focused on Latinx reproductive rights. That's Raisa Planned Parenthood here. We have local, indigenous organizations, that's Red Skirt Society. We have churches like Salem Lutheran. We have the LGBT community like Spectrum Center Spokane. We have, some sort of general affiliation groups like Eastern Washington Progressives. And then we also have activist groups like the Human Rights Activist Coterie of Spokane. This is a glimpse at who has come together under this. So now I want to dig into a bit of what the Platform for Change is. The original document was a pretty long document. And we did essentially a public reading of it, but the way I wanted to talk about it today to offer more time for talking is to just sort of go over the 4 headers that we had in the document and talk about what they were in terms of policy change. So we have 4 main things that we said. When we broke it down for the press, we said we want to defund the police, to invest in community. That included addiction and mental health services, housing and tenant protections, and to remove the police from public schools as part of dismantling the school to prison pipeline. We wanted to change police culture. We led the idea that had been floated earlier of disbanding the Spokane Police Department to hiring a smaller group of public servants to carry out narrowly defined duties. We also talked about de-escalation training for the SPD and county forces. Here in Washington, Initiative 940 was passed, I want to say in 2018. It might have been later than that. But much of it had not been implemented, frankly. And we basically said, hey, the will of the people was behind de-escalation then, and it is with it now. And we're going to, shed more light on that again. We also wanted to demilitarize the police. This doesn't just mean not giving them the opportunity to have weapons of, military weapons in their possession and use, but also the way that police attire themselves makes them look like they're headed into enemy territory. From their giant flak jackets and their extra magazines, their nightsticks that you can see at all times, and their guns, they look like they're kitted out for war in Fallujah, not to be on the streets of, I would like to think pretty chill American city when it comes down to it. We feel like that dress sent a message that we didn't like, that somehow the police are at war with our community as opposed to being a part of the community. Then there was justice system reform. One of our first bit was No New Jail. That is a campaign that's been alive and well in Spokane for years now with our partners, with other partners like the Peace and Justice Action League of Spokane and other Spokane specific entities. There has been a push from our local community or local justice professionals to get a new jail. And we keep pushing back saying incarceration is not the answer. We also wanted additional judicial accountability. So we demanded that the county, in cooperation with the courts, release local sentencing data. Hopefully, at the time we were asking for it to be disaggregated by the demographics of the judges and the defendants and the people who are appearing before them. Eventually, what ended up happening with this is that we just got a data dump from our county. And we said, all right, fine, you won't give us the disaggregated data, sort through it ourselves. We also asked and continue to ask for a fully funded and staffed Office of Civil Rights for the city of Spokane. Finally, the 4th major heading and the pieces below that, where we demanded police oversight. So no Spokane Police Department contracts without an Office of Police Ombudsman that was independent and empowered to investigate and publish closing reports. We wanted civilian oversight of police hiring practices and mandatory body cameras for the SPD and the Sheriff's Office. So a bit of a timeline. In 2020, we launched in July 19, we launched it as a living document. Our most recent revision was made June 18, 2021. June 29, in the wake of this push, probably one of our proudest moments, the Spokane City Council voted 7-0 against an unjust police contract after our cross-platform campaign by our coalition. They said they got more emails about that contract than about any other issue they'd received before. The people who'd been elected said they'd, quote, never seen so much democracy. That's what the City Council and the President said at the time. On August 20, days after mobilizing, we also successfully lobbied them to delay a vote for additional funding for the SPD and their agenda. We continue to support the No New Jail campaign and stand against carceral expansion, and we support the work of our constituent organizational members. That last bit is hiding a lot of work. So our constituent organizational members include like the Tenants Union of Washington, their branch here in Spokane, and every time they move for housing justice, we're moving together and pushing and amplifying that voice. It includes every time the Peace and Justice Action League notices and Smart Justice Spokane and Greater Spokane Progress say, hey, there's something going on with our county commissioners or our Spokane Regional Law and Justice Council. There's a lot of hubbub around that. Or what's happening with just the way they're handling incarceration right now. When they're raising a flag, we're supporting that, and we're also on the front lines with them. So there's a lot of work hidden in the bit about constituent organizational members. I want to talk a bit about our strengths as a coalition and our strengths really as an organization. First off, we have a lot of relationships with people in power. SCAR has worked really hard, as have other partners, to cultivate relationships with individual city council members, with attorneys, with elected officials, with people who work in offices who can feed us information. I don't know how many times I've gotten a text or an email from someone who says, hey, I hear this is about to happen in City Hall, or hey, I hear this is about to happen in the county. And it's led to us getting sometimes a, not always a substantial, but a decent 24, 48-hour jump on something. We have, because of our relationship with other organizations, that translates to a lot of soft power, right? So when we move people, listen, and that's because of that slide that I showed you with the 26 organizations that signed on. We are able to speak not just as SCAR, but often pull a lot of that list with us. And something I didn't know before, when SCAR started in 2017, we were a 100% volunteer organization. And we had, I want to say, 8 members in total who did the steering committee members who has done over the course of the history, I would say 85 to 90% of the work. So just really 8 highly motivated people. And only recently have we gotten funding and become staffed. And now I've gone from being a volunteer steering committee member to being a paid staff member. A lot of what people are seeing recently is the fruit of a lot of volunteer work to get us to this point. The ability to gather coalitions, I think that's what this whole thing is about. And of course, community ties and community voice. Community ties being that, we aren't people who parachuted in from somewhere else to do activism. We're people who live and work in Spokane. On this panel right now, we've got 2 pastors, a professor, and I would call myself an educator. I, at different times, and while I've been on SCAR steering committee, worked as a local sex educator with Planned Parenthood, spent a lot of time going to our local juvies and our youth shelters and our facilities that deal with youth who are struggling with addiction, and all the places where, the way I describe my job, all the places where youth get thrown away. Unfortunately, that's where I spent all my time going to day in, day out. And that was my day job. And so we have, between educators and pastors and the other people who we have on our steering committee, people with ties to the community whose day jobs are to deal with the community and care for the community day in and day out. That translates into community voice. Those relationships mean that we can speak saying, hey, this is what I'm hearing. This is what's happening out there. This is what I'm seeing. And then to also elevate the voices that we have regular contact with. Because of these strengths, our core strategies have been, what we said in our mission earlier, to educate, to advocate, to research, to engage the community that we're a part of, to translate that into policy, specific policy advocacy, and to challenge existing structures. We have done a great job of rallying public pressure through emails, such as when we shut down that one contract, through phone calls, public comment at public meetings, meeting packing. Hey, this is going down. Everyone show up to this thing. Fill this room, fill this Zoom. And harnessing community voice through statements in media, such as, maybe there was a full page ad in the Spokesman Review that we did once to talk about that same police contract, getting pastors on board and other powerful voices to say, hey, you passed the city council, you're speaking out against all of these people and the community is going to know it. Also harnessing community, also a lot of watchdogging. I would say a solid 80% of what we've done for the longest time has been a lot of public meetings, a lot of showing up and saying, hey, government, we see you. So that's where I'm going to leave it. That's the background of who we are, the platform for change and what we've done with it. And I wanted to leave a lot of room for questions and comments. So I will turn it over to Pooyan.
Thank you, Jack, for your presentation. And as I mentioned, so now I will start the conversations with a few questions to my fellow steering committee members, but feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A anytime. And Francis, thank you for your question to get this started. Before I get to Francis' question, I wanted to give the opportunity for the audience members, especially those who are not from Spokane, to know a little bit more about SCAR. And my first question is actually going to Pastor Kendricks as one of the founders of SCAR. Jack mentioned in the presentation a little bit how SCAR got started, but Pastor Kendricks, can you share with us kind of the more personal story of how you created SCAR back in 2017?
Well, thanks, Doc, for the question. Just out of, in our mission statement, it really tells the whole story. Outrage. I'm dating myself, but back in the day, watching the old-timey Westerns, if someone got shot in the back, they got dry gulched, bushwhacked, a variety of terms to explain what happened to that person. And in 2017, for a person, or better yet 2016, for a person to be shot in the back from 30 feet. And I still have on my desk at the church a tape measure that's 30 foot long that reminds me of William Poindexter and of the outrage we felt, and I felt, along with Sandy Williams. And we knew we had to do something, and we knew we had to galvanize this community, and we galvanized it around William Poindexter's murder. I mentioned the word murder as I appeared before various groups, and a lot of people took offense to that. And it's interesting, and I'll close on this, it's interesting how William Poindexter morphed into George Floyd. Just a fascinating concept. William Poindexter here in Spokane morphed into George Floyd 3 years later. And so that's how SCAR came into being, just out of the outrage. What was that famous line? We were mad as hell and we weren't going to take it anymore. And that's how SCAR came into being, out of outrage. So hopefully I answered your question, Doc.
Thank you, Pastor Kendricks. You answered it very well. Thank you. And so now I have another question that is for our other pastor here, Rick. One of the very first things that SCAR started to do is, as Jack mentioned, is to serve the as a watchdog. And one of the groups that we have watched closely from the very beginning of SCAR is the Spokane Regional Law and Justice Council. So can you share with us what SCAR has done to hold Spokane Regional Law and Justice Council accountable and what are some of the controversies that they had created in the last few years?
Certainly. And I'm counting on the rest of you chiming in, whatever I leave out. So the previous Law and Justice Council, before it was deconstructed, which is a whole nother story, with a lot of SCAR leadership involved in it, in resisting that deconstruction, had a racial equity committee. So over time, a number of us were voting members of the committee, others showed up and attended. And this was a voice of the community. This was a positive part of an organization that was within the system. But it was very distanced from that source of power, which is the county Board of County Commissioners. So we'd show up, we would attend and participate in that committee. We would also show up in the monthly Spokane Regional Law and Justice Councils. If there was a big issue, we would send, we'd beat the drum and send out the message and more people would show up. Sometimes if it was a hot issue, we would wear our buttons, SCAR buttons, and we would pass them out to others so that our presence, even non-verbally, because sometimes we weren't allowed to speak. The public was silenced in some of those meetings, but they knew we were there. They couldn't get rid of us. When the Board of County Commissioners made this power play, we pushed back as best we could. And like Jack said, in terms of our leadership style, we were coordinating with others, amplifying voices, making a list of who would speak because we had just a limited amount of time to speak on these Zoom SRLJC meetings. We had special meetings with our allies in strategizing on how to push back, looking at their bylaws. But in the end, the county commissioners have all the power. And so they deconstructed the system, and we're still protesting that and making public and hopefully making them accountable next time an election comes. There was a piece in the Spokane Review newspaper just today by two of our allies, and I'm sure SCAR will then amplify that voice and send it out to all of our membership and put it on our webpage. Very well written, and so part of our significance and success is to amplify the power of others, and this is an example of that. Anything else, Jack?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, you mentioned the power play, and my understanding is there's a lot of people in this audience who aren't from the Spokane area, and so I wanted to clarify real quick what you're referencing for folks. What Rick is mentioning is, or referencing, is the Spokane Regional Law and Justice Council, real quick, was essentially intended to be an organization with all the right people who could make all the right reform changes. And that meant, our local prosecutor, representatives of our courts and judges and whatnot, but also impacted communities and people with justice involvement, all of those things, right? And what the power play was originally, frankly, to shrink this larger council into a group so small that all of the power was concentrated amongst essentially 3 or 4 white men. Our prosecutor, I believe our sheriff was on that list, and a couple of other, and like county commissioners. I'll be honest, I don't remember the original, and Rick, this is where you might have to bounce back and say what that composition was. But do you remember actually who it was?
Yeah, it's the law and justice people, the prosecutor and the sheriff and the county prosecutors, and I think maybe one other, but
Yeah.
you mainly got it. And that's one of the filters that they use. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, just to wrap it up, we went, hey, you're taking this vibrant organization that has struggled a lot to do its job, let's be clear, and needed accountability all the time. But you're taking this organization that at least had all the right people at the table and really just trying to shrink it and concentrate your power. And that's why, Rick called it a power play. That's really what it was for a couple of justice professionals, white male on the punitive side of the coin, frankly. And we made enough noise that they kept the fig leaf of a racial equity committee when they finally reformed. But I call it a fig leaf. I think my fellow panelists would agree with me that it's a fig leaf in that it's a group without real power. It's yet another advisory thing, but they knew they couldn't handle the optics of completely removing everyone from color of the room, completely removing everyone impacted from the room. So they provided us with a little consolation prize. Hey, you're still here. And we're working with that new reality. So I just want to throw that out there.
Walter, do you have, Pastor Kendricks, do you have anything to add to that?
No, they said it quite eloquently. It's just an interesting dynamic. I found that people that have power very rarely are willing to share it, and even more rarely are willing to give it up. And so the journey for justice, the fight for justice, the fight for just our basic human rights, it goes on. It's been taking place since 1619, and it's 2021, and we just have to be vigilant. We have to be strong, and we just have to continue to strive on. It's just a shame. I think about it, how people treat other people. But anyway, they said it all, and thank you, Doc.
Thank you. And I think for the next question, I want to get to what Francis was asking, and also to use this opportunity for our panelists, my fellow steering committee members, to give the folks who are not from the Spokane area a sense of kind of how things work in Spokane area or Eastern Washington in general. So Francis' question was, what makes the campaign against racism in Eastern Washington so difficult? So, and this, I hope all three of you would answer.
Well, I'll start, and that is it. Spokane is 92% white, and that not only is a huge portion of white privilege, but it also reflects the history of white privilege. So there was a Chinatown in the 1880s and 1890s, and when the fire came in 1892, as I understand, the Chinatown was conveniently not rebuilt. They weren't wanted. And so the fact that Spokane is 92% white is a result of decades of successful racism. For instance, many Blacks in the South are were very knowledgeable farmers. And when they migrated, this is a farm area. But we look around and say, how many farms are farmed by people of color? And I don't have a statistic, but I can tell you it's minuscule. Jack?
Yeah, I want to riff off of that. I think there's this misconception that the Northwest is white on accident. It's not. In fact, in some ways, not only has it been intentional, things like intentionally not rebuilding the Chinatown or erasing the history of Black Western settlers here in Washington, here even in the Spokane area, in the Palouse, there were Black farmers who worked this land, and that's just been erased. Not to mention the genocide against Native Americans, like the glaring, obvious, there were Native communities here that were that were victims of both literal and cultural genocide. That all of those things conspired together to make this area more white. Well, it wasn't. And on top of that, I think it's also worth noting that what is called the Northwest Imperative, which is basically that white supremacists looked at this area, said, hey, there aren't a lot of people of color here. This is where we can make our stand. If we force out the rest of the people of color, we can create, well, they didn't say people of color, but we can force out those people, we can create a white homeland here. And that history of the Northwest Imperative has actually attracted to the Northwest large numbers of white supremacists. So people are like, oh, how can you have racism when you don't have a lot of diversity? Well, incidentally, it's quite virulent here. But I'm gonna try and like rein it in and not talk too long, but my personal experience is that I grew up in Eastern Washington. I grew up in the Walla Walla County. My family lived out in the county, you know, 1 acre lot, Loudon, if you've ever heard of it, tiny town that you will never have heard of if you're not from Eastern Washington, was down the road, 10 minutes away from town. And the closest real town was Walla Walla. And it's, you know, it was only 10 minutes away, 10, 15 minutes away. But I never had the luxury of being from where I'm from. You know, I was born in the Walla Walla General Hospital, since closed, like so many rural hospitals. I was raised, you know, out in the farmland, essentially, with cows across the street. I'd never known any other home but Eastern Washington, but invariably, whenever someone meets me, they ask me, so where are you from? There's a deep sense that if you're of color, you don't belong here. And I kind of staked my flag in Eastern Washington and said, you know, essentially, screw you, this is my home too. And you can't have it, or at least you can't take it from me. And I think that's part of what makes this place so difficult, is that being a person of color who's from here, you can feel very invisible. And there's also a fair amount of Northern smugness, white liberal smugness. The idea that because we don't have, you know, a history of slavery in the same way that the South does, that somehow the North is above this, that the West is above racism or removed from racism, when really it's just really insidious and below the surface, where, you know, some of my cousins who live down South will talk about how they can know really quickly if someone doesn't like them as a Black person. Up here, I've got to wait 6 months for, you know, Gina in the office to make it obvious for me to discover that Gina in the office has been sabotaging me or whatever. Gina's not a real person, but it's very insidious. And I could go on, but I guess to circle back and close it out, organizing against racism and fighting racism up here can be really difficult because it looks different from what people think it is. Racism is not hick accents and trailers, which by the way is classist. And it's not, you know, just the N-word being thrown at people. It's not just segregated drinking fountains or schools or anything else. It is whole systems that quietly and effectively shuttle other people to a second tier, sometimes without them even realizing it. It is quiet. It can be very polite. It can be very respectable. It often wears a suit and speaks well, and sometimes even calls itself a liberal.
Thank you, Jack. And Pastor Kendricks?
Yeah, I was looking at the question, what makes the campaign against racism in Eastern Washington so difficult? Well, it's a very simple answer, and we don't like to face it. It's the people. It's the heart of the people. It's very simple. Our racist county prosecutor, and I call him on it, Larry Haskell. He hasn't operated in a vacuum. He's exactly what the people want here. A jury of 12 white people. There's 5,000 Black people, not counting Native Americans, Asian Pacific Islanders, and all the rest of the minorities, going back to William Poindexter's murder, which is what I call it. You mean to tell me you couldn't find one person of color in Spokane County to serve on that jury? It's what the people want. And until we come to the point where we are willing to admit this is who we are, as Jack and Pastor Matters eloquently stated, there's history. There's history behind what it is we are saying. The Pacific Northwest was not, or it just didn't come to be. It was created this way for a reason. And until we tell the truth about ourselves, this is what we're going to continue to get. And we might as well admit it. And once we tell the truth about ourselves, which is why, just one other quick thing, which is why those in authority are fighting critical race theory so hard. All that is telling the truth about our history. Prince said in a song once upon a time, he said, you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. And so that, to sum it up, that's what makes it so difficult fighting racism here in Eastern Washington. It's the hearts of the people, plain and simple, in my estimation. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think with some of the dynamics you three have described, it might kind of lend very well to anonymous question, because I think, especially with some of the benign racism that some of you talked about, related to this question, have you had success reaching community leaders, members who claim that the goal is to treat everyone neutrally, exactly the same, and resist data and historical context that show that different strategies are needed to reach equitable outcomes? If so, what has worked?
You want to start, Jack? Go ahead and start.
Okay. So I'll say I feel like we've all had to approach this in different ways. I'll speak to the strategies that I used during one of my day jobs, which one of my previous day jobs involved doing a lot of racial equity training, incidentally. And I kept running into people who were like, but don't we just want everyone to be treated exactly the same? And the first thing I realized was that those conversations, for me at least, can't happen online, have to happen in person. I'm not a big believer in this notion that online world isn't the real world. It's totally the real world. I'm a child of the internet. But there's something to be said about the nuance of being able to speak with someone face to face. Even via Zoom in some ways is better, but being able to really interact with someone, whereas online we end up with this debate, this back and forth. So it was always best when I could get into a room with someone and talk to them. And when I would, I'd ask them some really simple questions about, what equality meant to them. What do you mean by treating people equally? And then sometimes I'd give them an analogy. I'd say, hey, do you have kids? And then, oh yeah, oh, can you tell me how old they are? Oh, I've got, a daughter who's 12 and a son who's 8, right? I'm making something up right now, an example. And I'd say, so do you let your 8-year-old son do everything your daughter can do? And I would ask them things like that, and they'd be like, oh, okay, they can wrap their minds around that. Well, now you're dealing with people who are at different levels of development. Well, that gets them in the door. Now let me talk about people who are equal, equal adults. I'd ask them questions about, do they think that it's fair that, people who use mobility aids can utilize handicap spaces at the grocery store or whatever? Oh, that's fair because it's about getting equal access to the grocery store. Okay, but it's not equal. So-and-so with a walker gets to park right in front of the door, whereas, you have to walk across the parking lot just because you can walk. It sounds absurd if I frame that as a bad thing now, because we're so used to that notion. Not that disability rights don't also have a long way to go, but that some of the most tangible examples of, we accept that curb cuts are needed. We accept that people with different needs need different solutions. And then trying to bring that around to race. That's what's been most successful for me in person, especially when asking a lot of questions and helping people kind of come to the conclusion about that, like, equity is a thing they actually do believe in by themselves. But I would say that that is usually an uphill battle, and frankly, only a successful interaction, maybe 35–40% of the time that I've had it, if I'm being really honest, and gets really hard and meets a lot of resistance when I'm coming at it, specifically from my SCAR place, speaking to racial justice. People are viscerally threatened by racial equity in a way they aren't threatened by other types of equity. But to return to the question to close out, people talk about the people who want to treat everyone the same. They believe in equity. They do. They believe in it when it comes to disability. They believe in it when it comes to parenting. They believe in it when it comes to working with different students in a classroom. What does one student need versus what another student needs to reach the end goal of access to education or to get it or to learn something? It's when it comes to race that all of a sudden it gets scary.
Thanks, Jack. And just to add on a few thoughts, one of our techniques was to establish court watch. And so we'll take a trial, and COVID, we started this, and then COVID obstructed our continuing, and we're just now putting it back into place, where there's a trial that is clearly got racism in the crime, and we'll watch, and we'll be very public that people know we're there, and the press might come and interview a couple of our members, so it's a way of saying the community's watching, and we're watching through the racial equity lens. So we expect you to act accordingly. We do have relationships with allies within the system, people of good intent, who are bumped up against the same power structures that we do. Try to work around that. There's a suggestion, for instance, that some of those groups might form an interagency committee within the criminal justice system to find ways to make improvements and decrease racism within the system, separate from the new form of the SRLJC. So we'll support things like that. We go to the community or the county health district and attend meetings about making sure that people are incarcerated receive vaccinations, or at least offered to receive vaccination, and the people who work in the system, as much as possible, receive vaccinations. I personally am involved in teaching the white church about racism and the comfort and the seduction of the comfort and the seduction of being, colorblind. It perpetuates racism. So I could go on, but I'll let Pastor Kendricks have a turn at the pulpit. Come up to the pulpit, sir.
Do I get to pass the hat since I'm in the pulpit now, sir? Do I get to?
Yeah.
My good friend Jack, and I sincerely mean that, my good friend Jack touched on it, and I'll just say a couple things. First of all, I don't want to be treated equitably. I want to be treated fairly. That's the way, that's how I want it. I wanted to be treated fairly because there's an absolute standard. You can't treat everybody equally because justice is not a one size fits all. There has to be provisions for mercy within the context of the law. That's the first thing. Second thing is let's see how to put this. Have we reached out to various leaders and have we done all those things that the question posed? Yes, we have. And I submit unto you the greatest, and this is where Jack was, the greatest threat to justice, I submit, is not by my right-wing conservative friends. I have a whole bunch of them. The greatest threat to justice for people of color is by the white liberal. And what makes me say that? Because the white liberal is only going to go so far. They're only going to go so far because when my being treated fairly in their eyes infringes upon their rights, that's where they stop. And that's why I love SCAR, because within our group, we are all equals. That's why I'm embarrassed when they say I'm a founder, I'm blah, blah, blah. No, I'm just one of many. And that's what it might sound like I'm preaching, and I'll close on this one. Paul said, or he wrote in his writings, though we are many, we are one. And that's why I love SCAR so much, because we are equals. I mean, we have super smart Doc. We've got Jack that's utterly motivated. We've got a white pastor that when I met him, I knew there was something different about him. The first time I saw him in my life, I looked at him and I knew there was something special about him. So I don't want to be treated equitably. I want to be treated fairly. And I don't know why that's so hard for us to recognize each other's basic human rights. I would love to have the World Court come here to Spokane and charge our county commissioners with crimes against humanity, because that's exactly what they have done. So I'll leave it at that, because I'm getting ready to preach now.
Could I add one little thing that it will be an announcement to the SCAR board, because you don't know this yet, the executive committee, and I think is germane to the question that was asked, and that is we now have a relationship with a judge on a reservation. And when I went to speak to this judge a week ago Friday, they immediately spoke about how they practice restorative justice through the Indigenous lens. And so here's a resource for us that the Indigenous people can teach the system, teach us, and hopefully we can help them teach the system how to transform from into restorative justice. So that's, a hopeful window that just is opening.
Thank you, Pastor Meadows. You gave us the perfect connection to two other questions that people have asked, and I'm going to combine the two questions because they're related. Both questions from Claudia and Esperanza are about working with other communities of color, and coalition building is a big part of SCAR's work. And so I would like you all to panelists to address this question, especially how we kind of stay united when there are always that dynamics of all the strategies of divide and conquer, and how we have unity also in terms of focus, in terms of what our actual enemy is, but also what we are working on.
Go for it, Jack.
All right. I'm gonna start by saying that I think it helps to remember that our opponent is always the system. It's not any individual person. And I mean, and I say this, even sometimes I say this thing that like really throws people. when people are like, oh, do you care if so-and-so is a racist? And I'm like, not really. I don't care if any individual person is a racist. I don't get hot and bothered about any individual, calling me a name, harboring some opinion, having some backwards ideas about who's what. I care about the power they can exert from their position to harm the community. I care about and power is the currency of the system, right? I care about how our society is constructed, and does our society work in a way that conspires to beat folks down. So that's one thing that sort of keeps me focused, I think, away from looking at individuals as my opponents ever. And that includes, in that divide and conquer, that includes my fellow person of color. If the Hispanic Business and Professional Association gets a giant grant and gets a bunch of money, that doesn't hurt me. That helps them. It's not a zero-sum game. I do think there is a degree of attempts to divide and conquer here in Spokane. I think it looks different than it does in other places because, frankly, and I could be wrong, so I think I see it differently, but it's hard to numbers wise turn the whole Latinx community against the whole Black community, for example. All right, or the whole Asian Pacific Islander community against the whole Native community. Not that it is impossible, but I feel like that is a strategy that's just used less up here because of that. We're looking at 8-10% whole, recognized and counted in this area. And I say counted because I actually think there's more of us than maybe the statistics always reflect. But what I do see often is a lot of intra-community division where internally, and I'll speak to my own experience as a Black person in the Black community, one Black person gets to a point of systems recognition, is given a position of nominal power and authority, is given, the veneer of respectability or whatever, and sort of anointed as, oh, you are one of the good ones now. And then they'll fight to keep that. That person will fight, not always, but, once that person has been sort of gifted that by the systems of whiteness, the system of whiteness makes a strategic decision to then turn that person against the rest of their community. If not directly, then indirectly, by saying, hey, don't go too hard or too fast. You're on the inside now. Think of it's good that you're here. Don't scare anybody, and alienate them from the community, from the greater community, with seductive lies about what they can accomplish if they just, I see that strategy used quite a bit more often, intra-community, turning of individuals who have power. And as far as how we address that, I'll say that, I don't know if there's one answer to this. I'm really interested in hearing what the others will say about this. I think one of the things that I've seen SCAR do is somehow we have managed to get a lot of good systems relationships, honestly, and a lot of relationships with respected people, frankly. I can text our state representative, or like my state senator. I can text Marcus Richelli or Tim Ormsby and know that they will take that text seriously and respond to it. I can text our city council president and know that he'll take that, I've got their numbers in my phone. Somehow we've managed to do that and build up a really good reputation as an organization, I will say, collectively, because we all have our own contacts. I've got mine, Rick has his, Walter has his, Puyan has hers, and together, collectively, we've got a great reputation. And yet, we don't mind speaking truth to power. We've never minded being clear about where we stand and what we're about. And I'm actually literally going to ask the others, to say more on how we've done that, because I'm not entirely sure how that's all worked out, but it has, and it's something that we're very proud of and that we take seriously. And as far as how to push back against that sense of turning against the community, I know for myself, I try to never let myself become alienated from who it is that I'm about. and what it is that I'm about. And never, again, focusing on systems, not personalities. That also means on the ally side, you know, individuals, I may not get along with them always, may not always be on the same page, I may not be close to them. But at the end of the day, are we both fighting the system of oppression? Are we both on that same page?
Well put, Jack. Thank you very much. Yeah, so we obviously have the coalitions, which you've heard about, and there are multiple coalitions. We also have this sort of Venn diagram overlap. So one of our executive committee members, Curtis Hampton, is co-chair of Smart Justice Spokane, and I sit on that board. I take notes at the monthly meetings. And when Curtis had to step aside for a temporary personal leave of absence, Jack stepped in to be the temporary co-chair. And you go to almost any meeting and you'll find some of us sitting around listening, sharing, or providing leadership. And so in Ashantiland in Ghana, there's a figure called Kwaku Ananse, and he's a trickster. He's called the Spider-Man, and he builds webs, and the webs help bring justice about or trick somebody who's in power out of some of their power. And, you know, we do that by just showing up relentlessly and creatively. One of the creative aspects that we used, especially for missing and murdered Indigenous women from a group, I think they're called the Red Skirts, was to amplify their voice with something called gobos, which is a technological thing that is beyond my capacity here. So if Walter or Jack can talk about the gobo strategy, that would be great.
Gobos just allow us to amplify our messages by putting memes or by putting pictures or messages up on building walls, basically, for the most part. Very effective, very, very effective, very powerful. I would just say, real quick, though we are many, we are one. I totally agree with Jack concerning infighting is more of a threat than anything else, infighting within various communities. We, SCAR, part of our mission is to amplify other people's voices. And all, again, back to where I was, all we are requesting, all the Hispanic community, all the Pacific Asian Islander community, all the Native American community, all we want is to be treated fairly. And that's the goal. And you don't understand the oppression that is contained within the system when you are inside of the system, because it's part of your privilege. A lot of folk don't want to hear about privilege, but it's a fact. I don't know of very many Black people that own banks, insurance companies, education, institutions of education, so forth and so on. And it's all part of the system that has been put in place, which is what we rail at, to just be treated fairly. So thank you again.
So I want to ask a question to my fellow steering committee members. I think for those who are in the audience, you get a sense that how we communicate as SCAR through our SCAR steering committee members, we speak frankly, but I want to look at SCAR more kind of holistically. How has SCAR as an organization changed the conversation about racial justice in Spokane?
I'll go first on this one real quick. Dramatically, as Pastor Matters has said, and as Jack has said, we're watching. And darkness doesn't like light. Darkness flees from the light. And people do things in darkness because they think their deeds will be hidden. I'm preaching now. If you ain't figured that out, I'm preaching now. And so we continue. I love what Liz Moore said. She said some people or some of those in authority need to see the light and others need to feel the heat. And as long as I have breath, and I think my fellow SCAR leadership team will say it, as long as I have breath in this body, I'm going to fight for the rights of people who look like me. And not only the people who look like me, but the people who don't look like me that are oppressed. My Native American friends, my Pacific Islander friends, because as Dr. King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And I can't stand by idle when one of my Samoan friends are shot down, or one of my Hispanic friends are incarcerated and kept there because they can't make bail, or one of my Native American friends are treated badly. Can't do that. And so that's it as far as I'm concerned. Thanks.
So I'll address some of the how in the question, and that is we have, we basically operate on love. The diverse groups in the executive committee and of our volunteers, a deep appreciation for the leadership of each person on the executive committee, and we're mutually accountable. We have a system of keeping track. It's called Trello. And we use it when we meet, and our communication is intensive. We meet twice a week. And for an hour or an hour plus on a Wednesday morning and a Friday afternoon. And it just keeps us on track. It gives us time to build, to deepen our relationships with each other. If you haven't noticed, there's quite a bit of humor in the room, which is positive humor. It's not cutting humor, it's affirming humor. And time for long range conversations, but also just to get the work done. We are one of the few groups that are intentionally led primarily by people of color. And that's one of our goals, and it won't change. I was going to say one other thing, but I guess it slipped my mind, so I'll pass it on to you, Jack.
Before you go, Jack, if I could just say one other thing, and what I really love about SCAR, we don't care who gets the credit. We don't care. Jack, Doc, Pastor Matters, me, Sandy, Scott, we don't care. Let's just get the work done. We don't care, and that's what's unique about SCAR.
Yeah, I'll be quick as for how it's changed the conversation around the conversation in Spokane. I think it's really helped bring it to the forefront. It's not this like in the background, oh, racism exists, that's bad. It's gotten really specific. I think that's one of the things I'm very proud of. We've gotten really specific. We say this system is a problem. The way that Spokane County, for example, is spending its MacArthur grant is a problem. The way that our local prosecutor is disproportionately coming after Black, brown, and poor people like there's no tomorrow is a problem. And we don't mind saying it. So I appreciate that. It's gotten really specific and it's gotten out of the abstract. I think that's my answer.
Yeah, and you reminded me of a couple other things, Jack, and that is that we are intentionally an LLC and not a nonprofit, and that's so we can be political. We don't have the constraints that a nonprofit has, and so we have a couple political irons in the fire right now. And historically, for instance, one of the most racially justice-minded lawyers in town was seeking a judgeship. We kicked butt as politely as we could to help him. And actually, the phrase "kick butt" brings in another point, and that is, as in many white cities, there's Spokane niceness. And we are edgy, as you've probably heard, but it isn't just anger. It's creative edginess. For instance, the first time we approached the criminal justice system about getting data, and Jack referred to this, we wrote a public letter so that they couldn't ignore us. So we put leverage in the request, and they felt like I can't remember which committee it was. It's sort of the executive committee of the SRLJC or the administrative committee, well, whoever was. And we all sat in the room with them because they were, and then a couple of the IT people were there because they were intimidated by us because we were being forceful, and they might call us angry, but we weren't being angry. We were being edgy and persistent.
Thank you. And we have 3 minutes left here. I want to use the remaining 3 minutes since we have people who might be interested in joining SCAR's efforts, whether you're in the legal community or not in the legal community. So I just want to have our steering committee members, especially Jackson, you have been working with the volunteer coordinations about how people can get involved with us.
Great. So a couple of things right off the bat. You can help, you can donate. You can also join specifically the committees that were being mentioned. We have a writer's room that has some spots open that help create all the material and help us keep the community informed. We've actually got a couple legal minds in there. That's been very helpful because it allows us to phrase things carefully, allows us to write accurately about systems and whatnot, people with legal expertise. I'm sort of referencing a question that I saw in the chat. People with legal expertise have actually been really helpful. One of the things that we're providing right now are Know Your Rights trainings, and we're doing that through the local legal community. So if you or someone you know have a lot of knowledge around jail support and civil rights things, we'd love to continue building that relationship. Even if you're not down to necessarily do a training or anything right now, that's knowledge that we need in the room. We also have our data and research team that does a lot of great work doing things like pulling apart that county data that we mentioned about our, who is in our jail and who is being arrested. Projects that are being looked at right now are who is getting stopped for pedestrian interference and where are those stops happening. Basically who's being targeted by that. Those are great places to get involved with us. And if you're interested at all, this is where I put the plug, you can check out scarspokane.org. And you can also send an email to admin@scarspokane.org and check it out. Also, if you want to talk to me personally as well, I've got a staff email, which is jack@scarspokane.org, JAC, no K. Yeah, hit us up. Did I cover our bases, Pion?
Perfect. So thank you, my fellow steering committee members, and thank you for all the participants who joined us today. So we are at 11:30, right on time.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah,
Thank you.